In the quiet corners of the Wild West, where work speaks louder than judgment, some stories wait like iron in the coals, shaped only by steady hands and a brave heart. I set one condition at sundown and kept it. Folks in Redemption preferred rules stated plain as fence rails. And I'd learned the hard way that if you didn't speak a rule early, it had a way of twisting later. That evening, the sun was dropping behind the low ridge west of town, turning the forge roof the color of a tarnished coin. I remember resting my hand on the lantern hook outside my office, feeling the metal warm from the day. Martha had been leaning beside the water trough, arms crossed, chin high, though she looked worn to threads. Her hat was too big for her narrow face, but she held it like a crown. The stray dogs watched her carefully, not sure if she'd kick them or feed them, and truth be told, neither was I. The thumbnail prop, an iron horseshoe stamped with a single crooked star, hung on the blacksmith shop's open door behind her, swinging in the breeze like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. That shop had belonged to Walter Briggs for near 27 years, and for 20 of them it was the heart of the town's work. He'd been reliable as gravity until he wasn't. His hand had given out the month before, a twist of old injury that settled in like a stubborn tenant. He tried to hide it behind his apron, but I'd known the man too long. The way he shook after gripping a hammer gave it away. When Walter stopped working, wheels stopped turning. The ferry rope frayed without his skill on the splices. The rancher's plows broke and stayed broken. Even our battered jail door, rusted at the hinges, had started to sag like a tired mule. The town needed a blacksmith. And that was the problem, because the only person willing to try it that day was Martha. I'd heard every story about her since she arrived 2 seasons back. Too wild for a husband. Too quick to speak her mind. Too stubborn for the ladies' sewing circle, and too bold for the men who liked a quiet kitchen. She'd been hired and fired from more places than I could count. The laundry, the saloon, the stables, the general store. Sometimes for good cause, sometimes for no cause, and sometimes because the sight of her independence rubbed someone raw. I'm not fond of gossip, but a sheriff hears plenty without wanting to. And what I'd heard about Martha was this: she worked hard, she worked angry, and she worked fast. Those traits, in the wrong place, make trouble. But in a forge, sometimes they make miracles. The night before she approached Walter about work, I'd seen her behind the livery stable, practicing something with a hammer and a small iron bar she'd scavenged from somewhere. She wasn't swinging wild. No, her strokes were measured, intentional, like a woman tuning herself to a rhythm only she could hear. The clangs carried through the quiet alleyway, rising and falling like slow breath. Walter met her that next morning. The two of them stood in the shadow of the forge, his good hand on his hip, her jaw set. I watched from across the street as she lifted the hammer he offered, just to test its balance, I thought, and then she swung once. The sound that echoed out of that shop wasn't the clumsy ringing of a beginner. It had the low, confident note of someone who knew steel and heat the way some folks know hymns. Still, the town exploded like a dropped grain sack when he hired her. By the time sundown came, I'd had half the town at my door, each more upset than the last. Mary Caldwell insisted a woman working the forge was indecent. Joseph Kern worried she'd taint the business, though he couldn't say with what exactly. Mrs. Briggs, Walter's wife, sat quietly in the corner, worry tucked tight between her brows, though she never spoke against Martha. She only said, in her small voice, "Walter is desperate, his hand will not mend." And that was enough for me. So when I set my condition, ask as a question, I did it for everyone involved. If folks wanted answers, they would come to me calm, not shouting. If they wanted to judge, they'd better start by asking. If Martha wanted to work with Walter, she'd need to ask him respectfully, not demand it. And if anybody wanted to test my patience that evening, the question was simple. How will this hurt you, really? Most didn't have an answer. I checked my pocket watch. a gift from my late father, always warm against my chest, and crossed the street toward the forge. The light, spilling out from the open doorway, flickered against the dust, as if the whole building breathed with a fire inside. The crooked star horseshoe swayed again, catching the light, and I paused to steady it. The metal felt cool despite the heat behind it. Inside, Walter had set Martha to sweeping sawdust and coal scrap from the floor. He gave instructions in short, efficient lines, the way he always had. She followed them without comment, collecting the debris with long, even strokes of the broom. "You sure you want this?" he asked her quietly. "We can start slow," she said, a consent line spoken like a pact. "You show me what your hand can't do right now, I'll do the rest." Her voice didn't carry pride or shame, just steadiness. Walter nodded once. "All right, then." I leaned at the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. The heat washed over me, climbing my coat sleeves and warming the sweat at my collar. Martha looked thinner than I remembered, ribs almost visible beneath her shirt, but hunger hadn't dimmed her fire. Her eyes kept drifting toward the anvil, the way a thirsty person looks at water. She wanted to swing again. Walter noticed. "Tomorrow," he told her. "Tonight, you sweep and watch. Learn the shop before you touch a tool." She accepted that with a quick, firm nod. Her restraint impressed me more than her earlier swing. Near the back wall, the tools hung in a tidy row. Hammers, tongs, chisels, and one old file Walter had used since I was a deputy. The air smelled of iron, ash, and a sweetness carried from the pine scrap he kept for kindling. The anvil sat solid in the center, its face shining faintly where countless horseshoes, nails, and hinges had been shaped over the years. I cleared my throat so they'd know I was there. Martha stiffened, but Walter gave me a small, tired smile. "Evening, Sheriff." "Evening," I replied. "Just checking the peace." "Town at rest?" he asked. "For now." I stepped forward, letting the light fall across me. "But folks are stirred up about your new hire." Walter shut his eyes for a moment, like he expected that. When he opened them, they were softer. "Ain't like I had a line out the door." Martha's chin rose a fraction. "They think I'll ruin your reputation." "You can't ruin what isn't alive at the moment," Walter said dryly. "Town needs work done, and my hand doesn't agree with me anymore." I looked at her then, really looked. Exhaustion clung to her like dust after a cattle run, but beneath it was a strength shaped by hardship, not arrogance. She'd been judged for being wild, but what I saw was a woman who refused to bend where others expected. "Martha," I said quietly, "I need to know something." She tightened her grip on the broom handle. "What is it?" "Do you want this work because it's work?" I asked. "Or because it's the one place nobody can order you quiet?" She blinked at that, and her breath caught in her throat. "I want it because I'm good at it," she said simply, "and because I'm tired of being hungry." Fair answer. A gust of wind pushed through the doorway, rattling the crooked star horseshoe again. It gave a low, uncertain clang. A reminder, perhaps, that we were all hanging a bit crooked these days. "If there's trouble," Walter said, "we'll handle it." I nodded. "If there's trouble, I'll be here." I didn't linger much after that. My day had been long, and the dust had settled into the folds of my coat. But as I stepped outside, the last of the sun slipping behind the ridge turned the horseshoe a deep burnished red, like a promise waiting to be shaped. I paused, thumb brushing the cool metal again, then kept walking. The next morning, I returned before dawn. Habit. Old sheriffs rise early, even when there's no reason but quiet. Mist clung low over the main street, softening the edges of every boardwalk and signpost. The forge was dark except for a faint ember glow inside. Walter stood near the doorway, his bad hand tucked into his vest for warmth. "She beat me here," he said with a faint huff. "Martha?" I asked. He nodded, said she wanted to know how the shop wakes up. Inside, she'd already swept the corners again, even though she'd done it the night before, and she had arranged the scrap pile by length and weight. It was the kind of orderly touch only someone who deeply respected work would add. and quietly at that. Walter began explaining the morning routine, how the coal should be banked, how the bellows breathed best when pulled slow and even, how the tools needed oiling on the cooler mornings. Martha followed him step for step, her expression sharp with focus. "I never thought it would feel this natural," she murmured once, running her fingers lightly over the anvil's horn. Walter grunted. "You ain't touched a hot iron yet." "I didn't say easy," she replied. "Just right." A softness flickered across Walter's face then, one I remembered from the years before his hand betrayed him, a teacher's pride. I checked my watch again. Not because time mattered, but because watching them work made me feel like an intruder. So I stepped back to the doorway. That's when I saw Joseph Kearns striding toward the shop with that pinched look he wore when taxes came due. His boots struck hard against the boardwalk, and his shoulders were set like a man about to make a complaint sound righteous. Walter noticed him first. "Looks like we'll get our first question of the day," he muttered. Joseph stopped just outside the threshold. "Sheriff," he said with a stiff nod. "Briggs!" Walter matched the nod. "Morning!" His eyes slid to Martha. "You really going through with this?" Martha didn't answer. She let Walter lead. "We are," Walter said. "You're putting this whole town at risk." Walter sighed, his shoulders drooping. "How so?" he asked gently. "Ask as a question," he added, reminding Joseph of the rule I'd spoken the night before. Joseph swallowed. "Can she even read the iron? Does she know how to temper steel?" Before Walter could speak, Martha stepped forward. "Ask me," she said. Joseph blinked. "What?" "Ask me," she repeated. "You've been talking about me for months. Try talking to me once." A long silence stretched between them. Then Joseph said, quieter, "Can you temper a plow blade without making it brittle?" She nodded. "Yes." "How?" "With patience." Joseph's jaw worked. "Prove it." Walter looked at her, giving silent permission. Martha lifted a small bar of iron they kept for practice and held it over the banked embers. The flame licked it steadily as she murmured a count under her breath. She watched its color, dull red to cherry, then set it carefully on the anvil. Her hammer rose and fell in even strokes, ringing low and sure. When she quenched it, the hiss was soft but decisive. She offered it to Joseph. He ran his thumb along the edge, testing its give. A surprised sound escaped him. "How did you learn?" he whispered. She shrugged. "I watch what others overlook." He didn't have an answer to that. Instead, he placed the small piece back in her palm with a nod that wasn't approval, but wasn't scorn either. A start. Joseph walked off, muttering to himself, but quieter than before. Walter let out a breath. "You did fine," he said. "I know," she replied softly. The day stretched long after that. She worked the bellows and sorted the tools, and learned the layout of the shop like someone memorizing a hymn by touch. I checked on them twice more throughout the afternoon, each time finding her deeper in the rhythm of the place. Near dusk, a rider arrived with a broken stirrup. Martha fixed it in record time, her brow furrowed, movements crisp. By the time the rider left, wiping sweat from his horse's neck, the last light was fading. I stood by the Crooked Star horseshoe again, noticing how it swung less now, steadied by the day's work. Walter closed up the shop, his hand aching, and Martha lingered near the anvil, reluctant to leave. The fire dimmed to embers behind her. "You can lock up," Walter told her. She hesitated. "May I oil the tools first?" He smiled. "Go ahead." I left them there, lanterns glowing soft, the smell of steel drifting into the night. The rule had been spoken, the work had begun, and the forge, long quiet, was breathing again. Before I headed home, I whispered a small reminder to myself, repeating it like the midpoint rule it was meant to be. Ask as a question, and let the work answer. The trouble began 3 days after Martha started at the forge, though you could feel it coming like weather. The mornings had been cold enough to make the pump handle sting, and the horses kicked more dust than usual. Folks were still uneasy, and I kept hearing their uncertainty at my door. Quiet words, not loud ones. Most obeyed the condition I'd set, but fear travels on a mule's back. Slow, stubborn, and liable to stop only when something bigger blocks the road. By then, I'd taken to walking to the forge at dawn, not as sheriff, but as a witness. Watching the place wake had a way of steadying me. The Crooked Star horseshoe I touched that first day didn't swing much anymore. Martha had hung a heavier iron loop above it to cut the draft. It framed the smaller shoe like a parent hand over a child's, simple and strong. Inside, she and Walter moved in a rhythm that felt older than both of them. He spoke little. She spoke less. Coal hissed. Hammers echoed. Iron changed shape under their 4 hands. One old, one young, one failing, one fierce. I sometimes wished I could bottle the sound of that cooperation and pour it into the town's water barrels. On the 4th morning, I found Martha alone. Walter's apron hung on a peg, and the forge's fire was low. "Where's Walter?" I asked. She glanced toward the back. "Hand's worse today," she said. "He couldn't grip a matchstick when he woke." "And you?" She lifted the bellows handle. Even half light made her look sharper, like a blade newly ground. "I opened the shop." "You're not overstepping?" "He asked me to," she said, but her voice carried a tremble she didn't hide well. Something about standing alone in that big place unsettled her, though she'd never admit it outright. I helped where I could, checking the street, making sure nobody planned to cause trouble before coffee, but most of the morning passed in uneventful work. Martha reheated hinges, shaped small nails, and repaired a broken latch for old Warren down by the river road. She worked with focus so intense it erased everything else. A small, bright image stays with me from that morning, a single bead of sweat sliding from her temple down the curve of her cheek, hovering, then falling onto the anvil where it sizzled into nothing. She didn't notice. But the quiet broke just past noon. A rider came thundering down the main road, dust exploding behind him like someone had kicked apart a dune. I stepped from the boardwalk before he reached the crossing. His horse's sides were lathered, and the man pitched forward in the saddle. "Sheriff," he gasped. "Ferry rope snapped." My jaw dropped. "Anyone hurt?" "Not yet, but the barge is drifting with a team and wagon, family inside. They're stuck midstream." I didn't have to ask which rope. The same one Walter used to reinforce 2 weeks before his hand gave out. That rope was Redemption's artery. Without it, the river split our lives in two. I caught sight of Martha stepping out from the forge's shadow, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sheriff," she called. "Rope's gone," I said. "We'll need a splice ready in minutes or they'll lose the barge to the current." Walter had once told me that a good splice wasn't just tied, it was sculpted, and a bad one snapped like a promise made too quickly. Martha already knew. "How long to heat the iron for a sleeve?" I asked her, though I dreaded the answer. She shook her head. "We don't have time for heat. We cold bind a sleeve, clamp it hard, and wrap it with softened rawhide." "Will it hold?" "If we place it right." That was good enough for me. She ran inside before I finished the thought. When she came back out, she was carrying the Crooked Star horseshoe. "Why that?" I asked. "Because it's iron thin enough to bend cold," she said, "and it's already shaped to cradle a rope." I recognized the moment for what it was, the return of the prop, transformed by the work she'd done since first touching it. We mounted up and rode hard to the river, the horse beneath me lurching with urgency. Dust streaked behind us in thick ribbons. The sound of the river reached us before the sight of it, roaring loud enough to make speech a guess rather than a certainty. When the bank opened before us, the barge sat maybe 40 yards from shore, drifting slow but steady toward the deeper channel. The wagon inside trembled with every shift of current. The team of horses was panicked, stamping and snorting. A man held a woman tight. A child pressed her face against her mother's skirts. God above, I muttered. A few townsfolk had gathered, Joseph, Eli, half the Elm Street crew, but none stepped forward. Martha swung off her horse and knelt near the broken rope end. She lifted it carefully, testing the fibers. Rope's been wearing for weeks, she said. No one wanted to admit it was time to replace. Eli bristled. That's not the point. She ignored him. Sheriff, hold the other end steady. I took it, bracing my boots in the mud. She hammered the Crooked Star horseshoe flat against a split log, shaping it into a makeshift sleeve. Each strike was quick, controlled. The horseshoe flattened as though relieved to find its real purpose. Water sprayed up nearby as the barge lurched again. The mother screamed. The sound cut the air like a thrown blade. Hurry, someone shouted. Martha didn't speed up. She became slower, deliberate. A person rushing at a moment like this was a person asking to fail. Bring me the rawhide, she said calmly. Joseph scrambled to fetch it, trembling like a man who'd never been part of a crisis before. Martha slid the sleeve over the frayed ends. Pull, she told me. I pulled. She turned and faced the crowd. I need someone strong on the other side. Silence. No man moved. Martha glanced at me, an unreadable expression in her eyes. I didn't tell her what to say. Didn't need to. Ask us a question, I murmured. Our rule echoed at the midpoint like a braided rope made stronger the second time. She inhaled. Will someone help me? She asked. Still nothing. Then I felt movement beside me. Mrs. Briggs, Walter's wife, stepped forward. She was small, but she moved with a quiet spine. I'll help, she said. Martha nodded once, accepting the offering as though it were sacred. Together, we pulled the rope ends close. Martha tightened the sleeve around them with steady blows. Then she wound the rawhide wrap, wetting it with river water so it would shrink tight as it dried. The whole time, she didn't look at the barge. Didn't let fear steal her hands. Sheriff, she said finally, we're ready. I tied the rope to the mooring stake and signaled for a line thrower. 2 men flung a guide rope out, missing twice before catching the barge. When the main rope caught its weight, the barge jerked violently, the sleeve groaned. The rawhide screamed under strain. Martha held her breath. So did everyone else. But the rope held. Slowly, inch by inch, the barge drifted back toward the shore. When the wheels of the wagon finally touched mud, the mother collapsed into sobbing relief. Her daughter clung to her father's coat. I exhaled so hard my ribs ached. The crowd erupted, first in muttering, then in something closer to awe. Martha stood still, staring at the rope sleeve she'd built. I could see a tremor working its way through her arms, spent adrenaline, pure and simple. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just watched the river water drip from the rope, her breathing shallow. Mrs. Briggs squeezed her arm. You saved them! Martha's eyes softened. The rope held, she said. That's all. I turned to the men who had refused to help before. Some looked ashamed. Some avoided my eyes. Others stared at Martha as though seeing her for the first time, stripped of rumor and dressed instead in competence. Eli approached her slowly, swallowing hard. If you'd need a new length of good rope, I can bring some, he said awkwardly. She nodded once. Thank you. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was movement. And that matters in a town where grudges can dry like clay and never soften. When the family was escorted away and the crowd had dispersed, Martha sat on a rock near the river's edge, staring at her hands. Walter had arrived by then, leaning heavily on a walking stick. He took a slow seat beside her. You did good, he told her gently. She shook her head. I was scared. That's how you know you did it right, he said. Only fools feel brave before the work. She let out a small exhale that might have been a laugh. I approached them, wiping sweat and river spray from my brow. The afternoon light caught the crooked star sleeve wrapped around the rope, turning the metal bright for a moment. A redeemed piece of iron on a redeemed day. "You'll have a crowd waiting for you tomorrow," I warned her. "I know," she said. "You ready for that?" "No," she admitted, "but I'll show up." Walter patted her shoulder. "That's more than most." We rode back to town slowly, letting the horses pick their pace. Martha held the hammer she'd flattened the horseshoe with, tapping the handle against her knee in a steady rhythm, like the forge's heartbeat had followed her out to the road. A little ways out from town, she spoke without looking at me. "Sheriff?" "Yes." I didn't freeze because I didn't have time to think, she said. "But now it's catching up." "That's normal," I said softly. "I keep seeing the child on the barge." "She's safe," I murmured, "because you did the work." She held the hammer tighter. "Maybe that's enough." "It is," I said. A cloud of dusk settled around the rooftops ahead, thin and lavender. Tools clanked faintly in Walter's satchel. The crooked star sleeve we'd used shimmered in my memory, like a lantern's last flash before sleep. Before we reached the forge, I added, "When you go home, take a moment. Drink water, stretch your hands, you'll need them in the morning." She nodded, a small, grateful nod. The night rose quiet around us, and for the first time since Walter fell ill, I felt the town breathe a little easier. And the forge, I knew, had only just begun to show us what it could make. In the days after the river rescue, the town walked around Martha like you'd walk around a sleeping dog. Careful, unsure, but a little softer than before. Folks still talked, but with more pauses. The words, "too wild for a husband," didn't vanish. They just lost some of their bite, like a knife worn smooth by years of cutting rope instead of flesh. Work, more than talk, started doing the real arguing. Walter eased back into the forge for a few hours each morning, his bad hand bound with a strip of clean cloth. He took the lighter tasks, measuring, marking, planning, and let Martha swing the heavy iron. I watched them once from the doorway, his finger tracing chalk lines on a wagon rim, her hammer following the ghost of his old stroke. Teacher and apprentice, though neither used the word. One afternoon, the stage from Bent Willow rolled in late, brakes squealing, axles complaining loud enough to wake even the dust. The horses came in hot and trembling. The coach's side bore fresh scrapes that hadn't been there last week. I met the driver in the street as he climbed down, rubbing his knees. "Road treat you rough?" I asked. "Rough enough," he grunted. "Brakes near gave out on the last hill. Your Smith still mending wagon gear?" "Still is," I said. "Name's different now." He frowned. "He change it?" "Not he," I replied. "She." The driver followed my gaze to the forge. Martha stood in the doorway with soot on her cheek and her hair half tamed by a strip of leather. The crooked star sleeve we'd used on the ferry rope was visible down by the river road if you knew where to look, but here at the forge, you had to read the work instead of the rumors. The driver snorted. "Best not risk the line on experiments." I felt my jaw tighten. "You can roll on then," I said evenly, "but you'll roll on bad brakes." He looked at the coach, then at the setting sun creeping toward the ridge. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll look." We walked into the forge. Walter sat on his stool, polishing a small hinge, his eyes taking in everything without hurry. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," the driver replied. "Coach needs seeing to." Martha stepped forward. "What's it doing?" she asked. "Screams worse than my first wife on wash day," he said, then cleared his throat when he realized who he was talking to. "Brakes catch late, let go early, wagon sways." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Will, look!" Outside, she crouched beside the wheel, running her fingers along the iron shoe and the wooden block. She didn't rush. She listened to the faint creak as the driver pressed the brake lever. Then she pressed her ear to the assembly and did the same. "The pins are worn," she said. "So's the shoe. Wood's dried and cracked." "I've seen worse still hold," he objected. She nodded. "Until they don't." The driver folded his arms. "You sure you know stage rigs?" "I know weight and motion," she said calmly. "Iron doesn't care what name you give the wagon." He hesitated. "Fine, but I won't lose my team to pride." "Nor will I," she answered. He glanced at me. I shrugged. "She saved a barge this week," I said, "if you want a reference." That made him blink. We led the coach back toward the forge. A few townspeople drifted closer, curiosity outpacing caution. Mary Caldwell stood across the street near the milliner's, watching with her arms hugged tight to her shawl. Inside, Martha and Walter set to their work. He measured the worn shoes with a practiced eye. She shaped the new iron with a strong arm. The rhythm of hammer on metal filled the space between their few words. "Take a sliver off here," he murmured. "Roads are rutted this month." She adjusted her stroke, shaving iron like it was stubborn bark. When she quenched each piece, steam curled up, carrying the smell of hot metal and river water. If you're listening to this in the quiet, you might take a sip of water now. By the time the new shoes were fitted and the pins replaced, the sun was low and the forge's light had taken on that deep orange that makes shadows look almost kind. The driver pressed the brake lever slowly. The mechanism responded with a low, firm groan instead of a scream. He tested it twice more, harder each time. The coach rocked but did not lurch. He gave a grudging nod. "Feels better." Walter wiped his hands. "We'll see what the hill says," he replied. The driver glanced at Martha. "You do all this?" "We did," she said, inclining her head toward Walter. He scratched his jaw. "Well, if I live to gripe tomorrow, I'll send word." "Fair enough," she said. The coach rolled out not long after. Folks lingered in its wake, their eyes turning from the road dust to the forge door. The questions shifted little by little from, should she be there, to, what else can she fix? The answer came sooner than we expected. 2 nights later, just before supper, a rider from the telegraph outpost to the south came barreling in, horse blowing hard. He slid off the saddle and thrust a folded paper at me. "Message from the mining company," he said. "They're sending a heavy supply wagon your way. New drills, rails, all that iron they love so much. Roads cut near Dry Ridge. They'll have to come through the river crossing." "Tonight?" I asked. "In the dark," he said. "They're pushing hard." I felt the edges of my patience thin. "Did anyone mention we've got a fresh sleeve on that ferry rope?" "Didn't say," he replied. "Just that they can't afford delays, and if your town can't hold, they'll shift trade north." There it was, the looming threat, wearing the polite clothes of business instead of bandit masks. If the mining company shifted their route, redemption would dry up faster than a spill on hot stone. I found Martha at the forge, cleaning the tongs. Walter had already gone home for the evening. The fire was banked, but not asleep. "We have a heavy wagon coming through tonight," I told her, "full of company iron. They're planning to cross at the ferry in the dark." She frowned. "That's foolish." "Yes," I agreed, "but it's happening." She glanced toward the river road, then at the tools hanging on the wall. "The sleeve will hold," she murmured. "I'm not worried about that." "What then?" "The wagon," she said. "Weight like that can snap cheap bolts and weak tongues. You seen their rigs?" "Only in passing." She chewed her lip. "We can wait and hope," she said, "or we can prepare the ground for the load." I liked that way of thinking. "What do you need?" "Every spare bolt and shoe I can get my hands on," she said, "and men willing to help swap them fast, no questions. We'll meet them before the river and make the changes there." "You think they'll consent to that?" I asked. She shrugged. "We can start slow. Fix one problem, show them it holds. Then they either trust or they don't." Her confidence wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind that sticks. We walked together through town, lanterns swinging from porch hooks, gathering volunteers. Joseph came, maybe to make up for past hesitation. Eli came again, perhaps to finish the mending he'd started at the river. Even Mary stepped forward in her plain dress, clutching a bundle of rag strips. "I know how to keep grease off clothes," she said, "and I know how to tie a clean bandage. That ought to count for something." "It does," I said. We met the mining wagon on the road a half-mile before the crossing. It rumbled toward us like a moving hill. 4 horses pulling, 2 men driving, iron stacked high and strapped down. The front wheels hit a rut and bounced hard enough to make the cargo clatter like shaking coins. "Hold!" I shouted. The driver hauled the reins. The horses snorted and stamped, breath blowing white in the cool air. "What's the meaning of this?" the man beside him yelled. His coat was better than most, his boots polished. "Company man. Name's Sheriff Hayes," I said. "This is redemption. You're about to cross our river." "On a rope that may or may not hold," he said flatly. "We've been warned." I smiled thinly. "You've been misinformed. The rope holds fine. What I'm concerned about is your wagon." He scoffed. "Our engineers know their business." Martha stepped into the Lanternlight then, apron tied snug, tools hanging from her belt. "Your engineers built for ordinary roads," she said. "You're about to cross a slope to a wet bank with loose stones and a strong current." The man looked her up and down. "And you are?" "The blacksmith," she said. He laughed once. "I don't have time for jokes." "You also don't have time for a broken axle and spilled drills," she said calmly. "Let us check your rig. We'll start with 1 wheel. If it runs better, you win a safer crossing. If not, you've lost 10 minutes and a bit of local pride." He opened his mouth to snap back, then paused. The horses stamped again, impatient. The man rubbed his jaw. "What do you propose?" "Let me show you," Martha said. He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Consent, given in the language of men who hate to admit worry. We set to work. Joseph and Eli jacked up the front wheel under Martha's short, sharp instructions. Mary held lanterns and offered rags. I watched the driver's face as Martha removed 2 bolts, showing him how the threads were already chewed down, steel bright where it had been grinding. "These fail under a sudden sideways pull. You're done," she said. "We fit new ones, tighter, oiled proper. You'll feel the difference in your hands on the reins." He eyed the evidence, then glanced at his companion. "Let her," he muttered. Martha swapped the bolts briskly, sleeves rolled, forearms flexing with each turn of the wrench. Her movements were steady, not showy. A woman working, not performing. When they lowered the wheel and the driver nudged the wagon forward a few yards, his eyebrows shot up. The front end tracked smoother, less wobble. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be damned." Mary cleared her throat. "Or blessed," he amended. Martha stepped back. "We can leave the rest if you like," she said. "But I'd not recommend it." The company man sighed, pride folding in on itself. "Change what you must," he said. "We can't afford to lose this load." So we did. Under the dim lanternlight, townsfolk and strangers worked side by side. Joseph fetched spare hardware. Eli held wheels steady. Mary tore rag strips and wiped grease from hands and bolts. I took my turn at the jack, feeling old strength wake in my shoulders. Through it all, Martha moved like iron's own mind. She checked every wheel, every major bolt, every latch. She improvised small braces from scrap Walter had thrown in the supply crate last month, just in case. By the time we reached the riverbank, the wagon rolled like a different beast, still heavy, still dangerous if mishandled, but sound. At the ferry, the rope sleeve glinted faintly, crooked star iron hugging the fibers like a devoted arm. The ferryman, Isaiah, met us with a wary eye. "You sure about this weight?" he muttered. "We made her ready," Martha said. He squinted at her. Ready enough for the river's mood? As ready as honest work can make it, she answered. Isaiah nodded slowly. Then we cross. We loaded the wagon and horses onto the barge with care, distributing weight the way Martha instructed. The river growled beneath us, but the rope held firm. The sleeve did not creak. The wagon settled without a shudder. Halfway across, the current pressed against us. Testing, pushing. The ferry rope bowed, then straightened. Nobody spoke. The only sound was water slapping wood and a few nervous snorts from the team. Then, as steady as a drawn breath, we reached the far shore. The driver exhaled hard. "That's twice now your town kept iron and flesh alive," he said. "Twice in 1 week," I added. The company man looked at the rope, then at the wagon, then at Martha. In that moment, the math of his world shifted. "You're the blacksmith?" he asked, softer than before. She nodded. He held out his hand. "Company could use a posting like this. If we make Redemption our regular crossing, we'll need reliable work. You willing?" She studied his hand, then his face. "On what terms?" "Standard pay," he said. "Company rate." "Same as for a man?" she asked. His cheeks colored. "Same as for a smith who keeps my cargo on the right side of the river," he said. She took his hand then, grip firm, decision made. "Then yes," she said, "I am willing." The agreement was simple, but its echo carried far. Trade meant money. Money meant stubborn townsfolk might be willing to revise old notions if it kept bread on their tables. On the ride back in the dark, lantern swinging from my saddle, I watched Martha's silhouette against the stars. Too wild for a husband, that's what they'd said. But watching her that night, shoulders straight, hammer still hanging from her belt, I thought wild is just another word for not yet fenced by someone else's fear. When we reached the forge, she paused at the door, hand resting against the frame. The crooked star horseshoe that once swung there was gone. In its place was only nail shadow. She frowned at the empty spot. "Leave it tonight," I said gently. "You're spent." She shook her head. "I have one more thing to do." From a crate near the wall, she pulled out a piece of iron, familiar even in the low light. The sleeve we'd used on the ferry rope wasn't needed now. Isaiah had reforged a proper length. She'd brought the sleeve back with her, silent as a secret. She set it on the anvil, lit a small fire, and heated the metal until it. Her hammer rose and fell in slow, careful strokes, reshaping the crooked ring into something new. The sound was softer than her usual work, like a lullaby sung in iron. When she was done, she quenched it, then held it up for me to see. It was still a horseshoe, but truer now. Rounded, even, the star smoothed into a simple dot at the apex, no longer crooked, just honest. She climbed a small crate and hung it back in its old place above the door, tapping the nails firm. "Why the change?" I asked. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "Because I am tired of pretending things are crooked when they just needed work," she said. The new horseshoe caught the forge light and glowed faintly, not as a charm, not as a decoration, but as a testimony. Iron remembers the hands that shape it. "Good night, Martha," I said quietly. "Good night, Sheriff," she replied. As I walked away, the sound of the river, the wagons, the hammer, and the murmured thanks of strangers blended into a single, steady rhythm in my mind. It sounded like a town deciding, slowly and stubbornly, to trust the hands that had already saved it twice. And that, more than any vote or sermon, was how redemption began to call her something new. Lanternlight breathed gently across the forge door, catching the newly trued horseshoe so it glimmered like a small moon above the empty street. Inside, the banked coals murmured their slow farewell, and a thin ribbon of smoke climbed into the cool night air. I stood a moment longer than needed, listening to the steady hush of the river beyond town, its current carrying no urgency, only patience. The whole place felt held, by work done honestly, and by hands that had proved what quiet strength can shape. I turned toward home with a calm I hadn't earned, only witnessed. thinking how some lives don't need straightening so much as steady fire beside them. If this quiet moment brought you ease, you're welcome to share a thought below. Thank you for listening, and you're always invited back to the Sheriff's Quiet Hours playlist for more gentle stories.